I had exactly 612.14 teens in my checking account when my employer tried to turn my own work into the reason I should be grateful for being humiliated. That was the number on my banking app when I looked down under the conference table, trying not to let anyone see my handshake. 2 weeks earlier, I had paid for my mother's post-surgery home nurse out of pocket because Medicare had delayed approval again. 3 days earlier, I had replaced the transmission in my old Honda because missing work was not an option. And that morning, in a glass conference room in downtown Milwaukee, the company I had helped drag out of irrelevance slid a compensation letter across the table and told me my salary was being realigned from $126,000 to $5,400 effective immediately. There was a blue USB drive clipped to the top of the packet. I remember that detail because it didn't belong there. I also remember dropping my pen. Small human moment. Tiny sound. It hit the polished floor and rolled under my chair, and while I bent down to pick it up, I had just enough time to steady my face before I looked back at them. "Is this a joke?" I asked. No one smiled. Eleanor Voss, Chief Operating Officer of Halbrecht Water Systems, folded her hands like a woman about to explain quarterly targets to investors. "We're restructuring your role, Naomi. Not eliminating it. Not changing it. Restructuring." Corporate language always arrives dressed like reason. Around her sat 3 men in navy suits and 1 woman from Human Resources, whose name I had heard only twice before. None of them had ever spent a morning on a treatment floor. None of them had ever stood over a failed membrane unit at 4:30 in the morning while a city contract hung in the balance. But they all looked at me like I was a cost center. I touched the letter, then the blue USB. "What's this?" "Supporting materials," Eleanor said. "A summary of transition expectations." Transition expectations. That was when I understood this was not about budget, it was about pressure. They wanted me to resign. They wanted me to do it fast, quietly, and without severance. I sat back and said the only thing that made sense. "I'll need time to review this." The man from finance cleared his throat. "Naomi, if you miss this, you lose everything." There it was, the real line, the threat underneath the spreadsheet. He said it gently, almost kindly, as if he were helping me understand reality. If I did not sign within 48 hours, I would lose my title, my retention stock, my health coverage bridge, and any eligibility for the executive transition package they were dangling like a favor. My mother's rehab appointments started the next Monday. Her surgery had left her unable to climb stairs without assistance. I was her only child. There was no backup plan hidden somewhere behind me. I nodded once, took the packet, took the USB, and walked out before my face could say too much. Let me take you back. 6 years earlier, Halbrecht had hired me because their municipal compliance division was quietly becoming an embarrassment. My name is Naomi Mercer. I was 38 then, and 44 when this happened. I am an environmental process engineer by training, and the one flaw that has cost me more than anything is simple. I stay too long. I believe competence can outlast politics. Sometimes it can. Sometimes it just gives politics more time to study your habits. When Halbrecht brought me in, they had already burned through 2 directors in 18 months. Their filtration systems looked good in brochures and underperformed in the field. Their service teams were undertrained. Their lab data reporting was sloppy enough to make regulatory counsel nervous. City buyers had started using words like inconsistent and non-responsive in formal review notes, which is the corporate version of smelling smoke. I rebuilt the division almost from scratch. I rewrote testing protocols, standardized field logs, put chain of custody controls on sample handling, forced operations to stop treating documentation as decorative, built a predictive service model that cut emergency maintenance calls by 31% in the first year. Then I designed a retrofit package for aging ultrafiltration units that extended membrane life by 19 months on average in cold climate systems. That package alone saved 3 municipal contracts they were on track to lose. By year 4, the division they used to call a liability was generating 28% of company revenue. No one from the board visited the plant when we were failing. They came constantly once we looked good in annual reports. Eleanor Voss arrived around then. Smart, polished, broad-shouldered kind of confidence, the kind executives mistake for moral authority. She was excellent in rooms where no one asked technical follow-up questions. She knew how to repeat other people's work in language that made donors, directors, and lenders feel safe. At first, she seemed to like me. She introduced me at a regional infrastructure forum as the reason our compliance business finally learned how to keep promises. I should have heard the wording more carefully. Not the reason, a reason. People like Eleanor always leave themselves room to reassign credit later. The first crack came at a client dinner 18 months before the salary cut. A city utility director asked a technical question about residual fouling in low-temperature intake systems. Eleanor answered before I could, confidently, incorrectly, not slightly incorrect, fundamentally. I tried to save her quietly. What Eleanor means is that the issue isn't bacterial carryover alone. It's the temperature-driven viscosity change affecting flow rates across older cartridge trains. The client nodded. Eleanor smiled. Everyone moved on. In the car afterward, she said, "You can't correct me in front of buyers." I was tired and made the mistake of telling the truth. Then don't answer engineering questions you don't understand. She looked out the window and said very softly, "You're valuable, Naomi. Don't confuse that with being untouchable." That was Incident 1. Incident 2 happened 7 months later, in a board prep session. I had built the full presentation. 43 slides, field data, service maps, margin recovery, client retention forecasts. Eleanor asked me to sit in, just in case technical details came up. During the meeting, she presented every recommendation as if it had come from her strategy office. At one point, one of the board members, a retired judge named Wallace Deneen, asked where the new service threshold model originated. Eleanor did not look at me. She said, "My team and I rebuilt the framework over the last 2 quarters." My team and I. 3 words. I remember staring at my own hands because I knew if I spoke too quickly, I would sound emotional instead of accurate. After the meeting, I asked her why she had done it. She said, "You're not board-facing, Naomi. Be proud your work can travel." That was the dehumanization moment. Not open cruelty, worse, conversion, turning a person into a function. After that, the pattern became obvious. Meetings moved without me. Drafts left my desk and came back with my name removed from the key pages. Budget approvals stalled for weeks. Access permissions changed. A field failure in Green Bay got pinned on my service model, even though operations had ignored my staffing requests for 2 months. Then came the oddest thing of all. Late one evening, while reviewing archived compliance files, I found a contract appendix I did not remember approving. A licensing schedule. Tiny numbers buried in a supplemental bundle related to a private pilot system in Kenosha. Halbrecht had spun one of my retrofit sequences into a side agreement through a newly formed vendor entity called DSV Process Holdings. I had never heard of DSV Process Holdings. That night I took screenshots, exported the file history, and copied the access log onto an external drive. The next morning, the document was gone from the shared folder. Not moved. Gone. That was when the mystery stopped being office politics and became something else. When they cut my salary and slid that blue USB toward me, I understood the timing wasn't random. They were trying to box me out before I knew enough to ask the right questions. At home, my mother was asleep in the recliner when I got back. Her walker stood beside her with one of the tennis balls worn through at the bottom. The room smelled faintly of broth and antiseptic lotion. I put the conference packet on the kitchen table, heated water for tea, and stared at that blue USB for a full minute before I plugged it into my laptop. It contained 3 folders. The first was a performance review summary built from selectively cropped emails, half-context screenshots, and benchmark comparisons that made no statistical sense if you knew what had actually happened. The second was a draft transition agreement structured to make it look as if I were voluntarily stepping into an advisory role. The third folder was labeled Project Continuity. Inside it were internal copies of technical diagrams, process charts, and validation tables pulled from my old archives. Only these versions no longer carried my name in the metadata. Someone had scrubbed authorship fields and reissued the documents through strategy. I checked the file properties. That was their mistake. Metadata is one of those words executives only remember when someone else is going to prison. File creation times, edit histories, user IDs, embedded authorship traces from conversion tools nobody remembers to clean properly. Even after surface edits, digital documents keep habits. These files showed original creation patterns matching my workstation history, then later revision events through accounts tied to Eleanor's office. I sat down slowly. Then I opened the packet again and found the paper copy of the transition agreement. Buried on page 7 was a clause that almost made me laugh. Any claims arising from compensation disputes would be waived upon acceptance, except in cases of demonstrable fraud, intentional concealment, or misappropriation of authored work outside disclosed review channels. A fraud carve-out. Probably standard language to them. To me, it was a door. The second folder changed everything. Because until that point, I had thought this might be about pushing me out cheaply. Now I understood there was a reason they needed me weakened first. If I signed, I would be ratifying their story. If I resisted, they risked discovery. I called Elias Rourke at 8:12 that night. Elias was a corporate litigator I had met 3 years earlier during a contract dispute with a supplier in Madison. Dry voice, precise mind, the kind of lawyer who lets silence do half the billing. He listened for 11 uninterrupted minutes while I walked him through the salary cut, the USB, the metadata trail, and DSV process holdings. When I finished, he asked one question. Who owns DSV? I don't know yet. Find out. And Naomi? Yes? Do not sign anything, do not confront anyone, and do not touch company servers again from your office laptop. The next day, I took personal leave, officially to assist with my mother's recovery. In reality, to build a record before they could close it. My flaw showed up immediately. I was angry, and anger makes people rush. I wanted to march back into Halbrecht and ask Eleanor one beautiful, devastating question in front of witnesses. Did you think deleting my name changed who built it? Instead, I listened to Elias. He had me set up a clean evidence chain. Every document copied to encrypted personal storage. Every screenshot printed and logged, every file property preserved with export times and device IDs. He explained why it mattered. If we argue misappropriation, he said, they'll call this an authorship dispute. If we show concealment, metadata tampering, and an affiliated shell entity receiving revenue from your uncredited work, then we are in fraud territory. Different oxygen, different risk. I asked about DSV. He sent an investigator. 48 hours later, we had our answer. DSV Process Holdings was registered through a formation service in Delaware, but the beneficial ownership trail led to a family trust tied to Eleanor's brother-in-law. Not her directly. Cleaner than that. But not clean enough. 2 board-related signatures appeared on the pilot authorization chain. One was a procurement director. The other was a special advisor to the board's infrastructure committee, which meant this was bigger than one executive stealing credit. Someone had been monetizing internal engineering improvements outside disclosed corporate channels. Elias leaned back in his chair when he said it. That's your whistleblower angle. I looked at the folders between us. This isn't revenge. This is justice. He nodded once. Good. Keep it that way. The next week moved with the strange calm that comes when fear finally has a structure. Elias filed a preservation notice. Quietly. Not a lawsuit yet. Just enough to put them on notice that document destruction would become its own problem. He also drafted a confidential complaint to the board's audit committee, not the executives, and advised me not to send it immediately. Timing matters, he said. You do this before they make a public claim about your role, and they'll bury it as an HR dispute. You do it after they misstate authorship in a board-facing venue, and now we have Reliance. That board-facing venue arrived sooner than expected. Halbrecht was hosting its annual Clean Infrastructure Partnership Summit at the Pfister Hotel Ballroom in Milwaukee. City officials, procurement officers, donors, lenders, and media from 2 trade publications would be there. Eleanor was scheduled to deliver the keynote on innovation-driven municipal resilience. I received the email because someone in events forgot to remove me from the leadership distribution list. She was planning to unveil the Kenosha pilot as a strategic platform originating from her office. Elias read the schedule and said, "There's your public set piece. What do we do?" We let her talk. The ally twist entered 2 days later. Judge Wallace Deneen, the retired judge from the board, requested a call with me. I assumed he wanted to pressure me to sign the transition agreement and disappear quietly. Instead, he said, "I reviewed some old briefing materials and noticed authorship inconsistencies that bothered me. Then I heard you'd been removed from the summit program entirely. I don't like patterns that look coordinated." I said nothing for a moment. He continued, "I may be old, Ms. Mercer, but I still know when someone is being set up. If there's something I should see before Thursday, send it to outside counsel, not me. I am telling you this strictly as a man who dislikes bad process." Then he hung up. I stared at my phone. The board member I had assumed was part of the machine was not an ally exactly, but he was something almost as useful, a man with institutional authority and a personal allergy to being lied to in polished language. On Thursday morning, my mother asked where I was going. "To a hotel ballroom," I said. "That sounds expensive." "It is." She studied my face. "Are you finally done being nice?" I kissed her forehead. "I'm done being available." The ballroom was all glassware, uplighting, and self-congratulation. Round tables draped in white, company banners, coffee stations, municipal buyers in conservative suits, Eleanor on stage in a charcoal dress, holding a clicker like she had invented electricity. I stood near the back beside Elias, who looked like he had been born in a dark suit and low blood pressure. Eleanor began exactly as expected: discipline, innovation, public trust, the pilot in Kenosha, adaptive flow management, cost savings, scalable compliance architecture. Then came the slide, a diagram I had built at 1:14 in the morning 8 months earlier while eating stale almonds over my keyboard. No name on it now, of course, just Halbrecht branding and a caption, Strategic Development Office. Elias touched my sleeve once, not yet. She moved to financial projections, spoke about licensing opportunities and private commercialization channels as if these were visionary extensions of corporate strategy rather than concealed side deals. At table 12, I saw Judge Deneen stop writing and lift his head. At table 6, a city attorney from Racine frowned and leaned toward the procurement director beside her. Open loop, I thought, and then the payoff arrived. Near the end of the keynote, Eleanor announced that due to leadership realignment, future implementation of the platform would proceed without legacy dependency on any one technical employee. Legacy dependency. That was the line Elias had been waiting for. He handed a sealed envelope to the event coordinator and said, "Please deliver this to the board chair and outside counsel immediately." Inside were the preservation notice, the metadata report, the DSV ownership trace, and a short letter stating that Halbrecht was presently presenting disputed authorship and potentially undisclosed affiliated party revenue structures to public and quasi-public stakeholders. 5 minutes later, while applause began, the board chair was no longer clapping. He was reading. Then the ballroom lights flickered. Just once. A brief outage from a spring storm moving over the lake. The screens cut black for 3 seconds before backup power restored them. It was not dramatic enough to count as chaos, but it broke the rhythm. People looked around, people checked phones, people talked, pattern interrupt. When the panel session began, the board chair did something Eleanor clearly had not expected. He walked to the microphone and said, "Before we continue, I need a short recess for council review regarding a governance matter." Not an explanation, just enough. In rooms like that, language gets quieter right before reputations start tearing. Eleanor's face did not collapse. People like her never give collapse away publicly. But I saw the first real fracture in her posture. Tiny pause, tight jaw, eyes tracking 3 people at once. She saw me then, really saw me, not as function, not as staff, as risk. She came toward me across the edge of the ballroom while attendees began murmuring over coffee. "What have you done?" Her voice was low, controlled, furious. I said, "Protected my work. You are making a catastrophic mistake." "No," I said. "You made one when you thought I'd sign." She stepped closer. "Do you understand what happens to people who blow up companies in public?" I held her gaze. "Do you understand what happens when companies monetize employee-authored work through undisclosed affiliates and scrub metadata before a compensation coercion event?" It was the first time I had ever used language like hers against her. It landed. She went pale, not dramatically, just enough. By 4 that afternoon, the summit was over in spirit, even if the schedule still existed on paper. 2 city representatives left early. 1 trade publication killed its puff piece and started making calls. The board's outside counsel requested a full interview with me for the next morning. Elias told me not to celebrate. "Public embarrassment is not a legal outcome," he said. He was right. The official consequence came 3 weeks later. Those weeks were quiet in the way that hurricanes are quiet when viewed from orbit. Lawyers gathered affidavits. Forensic accountants traced pilot revenue. IT specialists confirmed authorship trails and edit histories. The DSV contracts expanded from 1 pilot to 3. Internal emails surfaced discussing leadership narrative alignment and the need to remove Naomi from innovation-facing documentation before Q2 comp actions. One message from Eleanor to HR carried the line, "If pressure doesn't move her, compensation will." I printed that email and put it face down. Then I waited. Halbrecht tried to settle early, first with revised compensation, then with a separation offer tied to a non-disclosure agreement, then with a consulting proposal designed to look generous while burying release language deep in the indemnity schedule. Elias rejected all 3. Finally, because one of the municipal contracts involved public funding thresholds and disclosure obligations, the matter moved into court on a request for injunctive relief and document preservation tied to related whistleblower and fraud claims. The hearing was not glamorous. No dramatic spectators, no gasps, just fluorescent light, legal pads, tired clerks, and consequences taking shape in measured sentences. But for me, it was the loudest room I had ever been in. Halbrecht's counsel argued this was an internal employment disagreement inflated by a disgruntled executive after a lawful restructuring. Then Elias stood. He walked the judge through the fraud carve-out in the transition agreement, explained why it mattered. Demonstrable fraud, intentional concealment, misappropriation of authored work outside disclosed review channels. He showed how the company had attempted to coerce waiver through compensation pressure while misrepresenting authorship and routing value through an affiliated entity. He introduced the metadata report, then the DSV ownership trace, then the internal emails, then the summit transcript where Eleanor publicly claimed strategic origin for work traced to my authorship files. The courtroom went silent, not because silence is magical, because the company's whole story had just lost oxygen. The judge, a woman with rimless glasses and the kind of expression that punishes exaggeration, asked Halbrecht's counsel a simple question. Was the affiliated entity disclosed to the plaintiff at the time her work product entered the pilot revenue stream? Counsel began, stopped, and said, "Not to my knowledge." That answer did more damage than any speech could have. By the end of the hearing, the court entered a temporary restraining order preventing transfer or dissipation of revenue linked to the disputed pilot systems, ordered document preservation under penalty, and set expedited discovery on the fraud and ownership issues. In practical terms, that meant the money stream they had hoped to keep blurry was suddenly visible and partially frozen. Asset control is not as cinematic as handcuffs. It is better. Within a month, Halbrecht announced Eleanor Voss was taking personal leave. 2 weeks after that, she resigned. The procurement director retired. The board's special advisor separated by mutual agreement. Outside counsel negotiated a global resolution before full trial. I cannot give every number, but I can tell you the structure. A multi-year settlement, formal correction of authorship on the retrofit platform, compensation for diverted revenue, release of my rights to future independent commercialization, whistleblower protection language, and, most satisfying to me, governance reforms requiring disclosure of related party innovation agreements going forward. No screaming, no revenge speech, no one escorted out in front of cameras, just signatures, filings, and a company learning that polished concealment is still concealment. My emotional twist came after the settlement, when a recruiter called with 3 offers in 2 weeks and I almost said yes to the wrong one simply because I wanted distance. That is what my flaw does. It keeps me too long, then tries to make me leave too fast. Judge Deneen, of all people, corrected me. He asked me to coffee after the case closed, not as a board member, just as a man who had watched the thing from close range. "You don't need rescue by motion," he said. "Only by standards. Pick the place that respects your work before it needs you to save it." So I did. I joined a smaller engineering firm in Minneapolis called North Basin Systems as a partner, not an employee. Fewer presentations, better people, real equity, clean paper. We built municipal retrofit programs the way they should have been built in the first place: transparent, documented, boring in the best way. 1 year later, my mother was walking without the frame. I had paid off her medical debt. My checking account no longer determined whether I could sleep. North Basin had secured 5 city contracts, all profitable. My name was on every filing that belonged there, not because I demanded worship. Because accurate attribution is cheaper than litigation and healthier than resentment. Halbrecht still existed, but smaller, more careful, less admired. Last I heard, they no longer described engineering as a narrative asset in leadership meetings. Eleanor never contacted me again. Sometimes I think about the blue USB drive, how neat it looked, how confident they must have felt preparing it. They thought pressure would make me choose survival over truth. They thought caregiving, surgery bills, and exhaustion would make me sign whatever they placed in front of me. They were not entirely irrational. Pressure works on people all the time. It just did not work on me. Not because I was fearless, because I was finally tired of translating disrespect into patience. There is a lesson in that, and it is not about outsmarting bad people, though that has its uses. It is about boundaries, about self-worth. About understanding that the moment someone needs you diminished in order to control the story is already rotten. The right response is not always louder. Usually it is cleaner. Better records, better counsel, better timing, better refusal. I still keep the first compensation letter in a folder at my office, not out of bitterness. As calibration, a reminder that some documents are not the end of your options. They are proof that someone else ran out of theirs. So let me ask you something. If a company tried to erase your work and pressure you into signing your own silence, would you walk away quietly, or would you make them explain every line under oath? And if stories like this are your kind of justice, subscribe and stay with me for the next one.